Hello. I'd like to welcome you to Philosophy of Art 101. Oh, I'm not allowed to call it that. Hi, I'm Robert Lingard, and this is Deviance in Society. I'm here in Lismore at the moment, looking at some of the artwork that we find in some of the back alleys. Now, when we've got graffiti like this, is this something that's acceptable and normal? Or do we actually have examples here of deviance, people breaking the rules, not conforming to the normal standards of society? So here we have some examples of art that's been placed around for various reasons. What makes a difference between something being an acceptable piece of work, something that is conformist, or something that is actually belonging to what we might call deviance? Now, when we talk about deviance in society, quite often referring to things that are, they're evil or they're dirty or there's just something inherently wrong. But what we're going to do throughout this unit is consider what is a sociological understanding of deviance. We're going to consider it within the context of society, of the way that people work together. We're going to apply different theories, sociological theories, and we will unpack them as we move through the lectures over the next few weeks. Today, however, we ask the question, so what is deviance? Is going to the back alley and painting on the wall deviance or conformity? Now, I would guess that some of these artworks here are very much conformist. We've got things that have been commissioned, we've got artwork that appears in promotional materials for the city and for the region. Gee, that would be very hard to define as deviant. But then there is other artwork or other sprayings of paint on wall. And I suspect that these are very much the nonconformist, deviant type of paint on wall. So, we need to move to a definition. What is deviance? Now, there are different ways that we could be looking at this. We could be saying that deviance is something very individualistic, that it's what happens within the person, or what is that thing which resides within the individual that makes their actions and their behaviours deviant. Alternatively, we can look beyond the individual and consider what it is within society, what is the social context within which the individual acts. And maybe that's where we should be thinking when we are providing our definitions and our responses to deviance in society. Now, as you might imagine, we're going to concentrate on the sociological theories rather than on the individualistic, but we need to look at them first. Now, we can define deviance in lots of ways, but we first need to acknowledge that society has its rules and its expectations. It applies norms, and individuals within that societal context, whether we're talking within a group, within a nation state, or anything in between, there are expectations and norms to which people are expected to conform. This is a way that we ensure that we have a society that is functioning and operating, and we know what's going to happen. And we know that people are going to be doing what needs to happen to make our society livable, and to ensure that we apply rewards to those who conform, and then we apply punishments or stigmatize or exclude those who don't conform. Now, we have our rules which may be obvious, they may be unspoken, but when they're formalized, then we have laws. It's much easier to say when someone is nonconformist when we are applying laws. We have standards by which those things can be measured. But that's not the only way that we might be able to define someone as deviating from the norms and expectations of society. Deviance, therefore, is when someone deviates from the norms and expectations. Now, I've mentioned that there are individualistic ways to look at what constitutes deviance. There are three frameworks in particular which we can apply. The first one is that we can apply the idea of religion as defining types of people by the evil that is represented by them and in their behaviours. Then we have biological standards that we can apply to say these people are deviant because of some inherent trait within them. And then there's a psychological framework that we might also apply. The psychological definition of deviance says that there is something inherently wrong in the way that they think. So, three different frameworks. The religious framework is one that assumes that there is evil in persons. Within religious frameworks, there are societies that say these are our expectations, and particularly if we're talking about theistic religious contexts, then there is God who has expectations about how one should behave and not behave. And there is probably some sort of definition of evil that accompanies that. And so the way that evil or the devil is expressed in that person's behaviour determines their level of deviancy. And then within those societies and those cultures in which the religious definition of deviance is strong, then we have reasons to say these people need to be excluded, or they need to be punished, or they need to be retrained, because there is something evil that is going on in their lives that deviates from what is the expectation of God and this society. If we look back at the Renaissance period, then we have the example of women whose behaviour might have been a little bit strange. Therefore, they must have made a pact with the devil. There is evil in them. There is evil active through their actions. We need to do something about that. And so we've got the histories of the witch hunts. There may have been other explanations for what was taking place for those women. But within those societies where deviance and conformity was being defined against religious standards and expectations, then these women were considered deviant because of what was within them. It was solely to do with them and the supernatural perhaps, but not with society at large. It's an individualistic approach to understanding their behaviour and their deviance from the normal expectations. We can also look at the biological definitions of deviance that have been proposed over the years. Back in the 1800s, there was work being done on trying to understand criminal behaviour that was very much being promoted by what was taking place within the scientific world, with Darwin's theory of evolution, of how people are a part of that process of evolution, and then misunderstandings of what the implications were from Darwin's theories, such that there might be people who haven't evolved properly. And if we look at the measurements of their head, of their stature, of the way that their body was presented, then we would be able to find indicators of, we would be able to find biological indicators that corresponded to their deviance. So their criminal behaviour was obvious, and if only we'd realised earlier that their forehead was rather bulbous and in a strange shape, we should have known that these were the people who were criminally insane, or these were the people who were predisposed to deviant behaviour. Lombroso was a medical practitioner who spent a lot of time trying to understand criminality in relation to the person's biological form. So what is it about their biology that we can see and observe and measure that will be an indicator for us of their propensity to be deviant in society? He was able to make observations of men in prison, was able to take measurements. There was no understanding applied as to what wider societal effects might be, but purely biological. We can see these sorts of biological expectations playing out later on in Nazi Germany. Eugenics is one of these things that it keeps rearing its head. In some ways it's showing itself again in our contemporary society. But it assumes that because there are biological determinants, because there may be ethnic and racial determinants, that if you have these particular sorts of traits showing in your body, then we can know that you are going to be a deviant in our society and that you are not going to conform because you cannot conform because you are biologically programmed to be this sort of person. Now, there was further work done by other medical scientists that used controlled groups. You'll read about it in your text. And they showed that actually there was no grounds for the work that for the conclusions that Lombroso was drawing. However, these sorts of understandings are still widely held within society, that if you are of a particular biological type, then there is something in you, and it's probably something that is inherited. It's a biological weakness that results in social deviance. So we have the religious framework, we have the biological framework, and also developing further from the scientific approach with the biological framework, we have psychological frameworks also. We think particularly of Freud, who was defining the way that human psychology worked. How does a person express him or herself in society? He was able to look at people and say, okay, a human person is driven by particular urges and drives, but in order to function in society, those urges and drives need to be properly socialized, trained, and as appropriate, suppressed. If the individual is not properly socialized, particularly as a child, then they don't understand how it is that they are to live in society. They haven't learned the proper self-discipline in order to suppress urges that will be harmful to themselves or disruptive to society. Therefore, we have psychological basis by which to define their deviance in society. And if we can understand the way that their psychology is working, or by these definitions, not working, then we know what it is within this person that is at fault and is responsible for their deviance. So we have these three frameworks. Remember, these are frameworks that look at what it is within the individual that is at fault and is therefore responsible for what is happening in their relationship with wider society. Durkheim took a different approach. Durkheim looked at a very, very individualistic act, and certainly within the context of his time, it was deemed to be a very, very individualistic act. He looked at suicide. Suicide is something that was deemed to be very much totally the responsibility of the actor involved. It was not a societal thing, it's what one did to oneself. Now, society was programmed so as to make sure that people didn't commit suicide. We don't want people escaping our society and not fulfilling their responsibilities. So it's about what the individual does. Durkheim did his studies, and he looked at the social context because he observed that while individuals may have committed the act, there were patterns that existed across society that showed that there were contextual factors that influenced what was happening to the individual. He was able to identify 3 different types of suicide pattern. He identified the egoistic suicide. That was when the person took their life because they were disconnected from society. His overriding conclusion was that patterns of suicide reflect the degree of connectedness that exists. Whoop, got a truck going by. This is the fun part of filming in an alleyway. Durkheim was able to observe that the degree of connectedness that existed within society influenced the rate of suicide within that society. So clearly there is more to this act of an individual than just what was in that individual or what was happening within that individual's thinking or biology or religion. There is a societal context which has an influence on the way that someone engages in what was deemed to be a deviant act. Therefore, we should consider individual acts within the wider frameworks of how society works or doesn't work. And that's something we will be exploring to a greater depth throughout this unit. Durkheim's work established that deviance within society is something that can be studied within the framework of societal contexts. Therefore, deviance will be defined according to historical periods, according to class, according to culture, according to ideologies. So the groups in which a person lives and expresses themselves will have their own norms and their own expectations of what is appropriate behaviour. Therefore, they also have, generally unstated, they will also have the expectations of what constitutes deviancy and how that should be dealt with. Now, Durkheim proposed that there will be deviancy expressed in any particular cultural setting. So he said, imagine that there is a community of saints, people who conform to the highest standards and ideals for living. So they're living at peace. In his thought experiment, he said, even while these may be the people who we would consider saints, eventually there will be things that happen within that community that don't conform to the high standards of that community. There will be new behaviours or new variances that will arise. They may be small and trivial in the wider society, but within this community of saints, they will be treated as rather serious breaches of the norms and expectations of that group. Therefore, even within what we might consider to be the perfect society, we now have examples of deviance from the expectations of this society, and arising from that will likely be new controls, punishments, rewards, stigmas, and exclusions. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at a range of theories, and I want you to think about how they might apply to the ways that people behave or misbehave within society. Things that we'll consider are, is someone who steps outside social norms, are they deviant? Are they criminal? How exactly should we regard them? How are they to be treated? Are they to be excluded? Are they to be punished? How should we look at these things? Think of a couple of practical examples. Throwing paint on the wall, is that something that should be acceptable? Well, if it's commissioned, is that going to be different to if it's done during the middle of the night? If it's a tag, is that different to if it's something with a greater artistic quality? Maybe something a little bit more common in Australia. Having beers with friends. Is that acceptable or not acceptable? If you're having your beers with friends right before you had to go out and drive home with your kids in the back of the car, is that acceptable or not? Smoking marijuana, particularly when you live here in the far north coast, is that acceptable or not acceptable? Certainly there are laws that govern it. But what if there's pain relief? that's involved in the smoking of marijuana to deal with an advanced cancer? Does that change the way in which we should be considering it? There are many other examples. One would be polygamy. How are we to view that? In some societies, it's quite acceptable. In Australian society, that's something that's generally looked down upon, and there are laws against these sorts of things. What is the role of law? What is the role of society? And how will that affect the individuals and the way that we deal with them? I refer you to your textbook. It gives a thorough account of deviance. It goes through the theories that we will be exploring in greater depth as this unit progresses. I wish you well as you engage in these studies. There will, of course, be punishments and rewards for those who conform and don't conform to the standards of the unit. So there might be a little bit of an irony there that we will have to work through from time to time. But I hope you'll find it interesting. I hope you'll find it stimulating. And especially as we work through this pandemic where mask wearing and vaccine taking is something that's becoming very much a societal norm, I hope you'll find lots of good material to think through. I look forward to meeting you in tutorials and in discussions, and wish you all the best as you experience deviance in society. Thank you.